Welcome to this video, great to have you on board. If you dive into web development or if you work in web development, today's landscape looks like this. We get tons and tons and tons of technologies you can learn, you can dive into. You might feel the need to learn them, and for some of them you don't even know what they do. Now, how did we get into this state? And more importantly, how do we get out of that state? Let me explain what all these technologies mean and how we work with them and how you make your way through that jungle in this video. So this is how today's web development landscape looks like. We got tons of languages, libraries, technologies. We got Frontend and Backend. We got different browsers. We got mobile and desktop development. We should optimize our code and ship as small code as possible, and so on. Now, if you're just starting off with web development, this is extremely intimidating. There are so many technologies. How do you know with which to start? How do you keep up with the rapid development we're experiencing here? Well, that rapid development actually is a thing. Things have extremely accelerated, but that also means you don't have to keep up all the time. It's of course always good to stay up to date, to dive into new trends, to have open eyes for them. But it's also important to understand that it's not about always adopting a new technology as one of the first. Because, and that's a good thing probably, browser support for such new technologies probably isn't that good anyways. But let's take a step back. Let's say you're starting off, or you started off but you're not super advanced. How do you navigate through that jungle then? Let's first of all split this up a little bit. We first of all have to understand that we got three core web technologies we can think of, and that is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Simply put, HTML is for the structure of our web page. This is why we write the XML-like structure, why it is like an XML language. Then we have CSS, which takes that structure and gives it some styling so that we don't have the ugly default styles of the browser. And then we have JavaScript to add some logic so that something happens when we click a button, or that we do some date picker which opens up, or some image picker or something like that. All these things which often are connected to user interaction, all these things that change the page at runtime, so after it has been loaded, all these things happen through JavaScript. These are the three core web technologies. They happen entirely in the browser, and correctly you might say, but the web is also about the server, and I'll come back to this. But even if these only happen in the browser, you gotta learn them. You gotta understand how that works if you wanna be a web developer. Even if you do focus on server-side development, even if you are saying, hey, I'm a PHP developer, you need to understand how these technologies work. You don't necessarily need to master them. There might then be better designers using CSS, better developers working with JavaScript and some JavaScript frameworks, but you need to have the basics set. And that is therefore what you should start with when becoming a web developer. If you're starting off, hey, this is your roadmap. Learn HTML, learn CSS, learn JavaScript. And learning doesn't mean master it. It takes a lot to master a certain language, but it means understand it, be able to write basic code with it, be able to read and understand the code of other people, be able to expand your knowledge in that area. That is what learning means. So that are the core web technologies. But as I mentioned, these all run in the browser. We also got a server side, and there we got an abundance of languages we can use, and these are only some of them, not even all. So we got Rails, PHP, Node.js, ASP.NET, and as I said, we got other languages too. Now, on the server side, we don't just have three languages therefore. In the browser we have a clear limited set of languages we can use. The browser only understands HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Now on the server, that's different, because a server is just a computer, and we can run any code we want on the computer. In the end, the thing that makes a server is the fact that it can handle incoming network requests, and, if it is a web server, send back HTML. Because again, we have to send something back which is understood by the browser, because the browser is our client talking to the server. Again, I'm speaking about web servers here. Of course, there could be different servers, mail servers and so on, but if we focus on web servers, then we have to send back HTML and optionally also CSS and JavaScript. How we generate this HTML, CSS and JavaScript is then up to us though. We can use any server-side language to output a certain HTML document and attach the right script files we prepared and so on. And on the server side, we also execute code which accesses a database, for example, where we reach out to a MySQL database to store and fetch data, or a MongoDB database. And these things happen on the server for two reasons. They are typically performance intensive, and you don't want to run such tasks in the user browser because this will slow down the user experience and you don't know which machine the user is using. And obviously, security. You want to run code that is vulnerable, that is sensible on the server. If you store some user-related data on the client in the browser, not only can't you access it globally, which is an issue if you really want to connect different users, but it also is accessible by the user. So that is why we have server-side languages. And it makes sense to also dive into these. Now, at some point of time, you might need to make the decision whether you become a front-end or a back-end developer. Back-end means you focus on the server side, you focus on server-side languages. A front-end means you focus on the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript stuff in the browser. Now, there are also full-stack developers which do both. That's also an alternative, but it always depends on the degree of, how far you want to dive into something. You probably have to pick a side at some point. But that's okay. It's still worth it to understand the basics of two sides, of both sides, no matter which role you want to take. And that is the only way to allow you to find out what you like the most if you're just starting off. When I started off, I had a look at both sides. I started off with PHP. Now, PHP is still very popular, but not the coolest kid in town anymore. That would be Node.js right now. Still, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn PHP anymore. That's just how it has evolved. But still, it's important for you to find out what you like. And of course, it's also important for you to find out what you want. If you want to become a freelancer, maybe you should pick a language which offers you the broadest client base. Or you take a niche so that you haven't got as many potential clients, but you also got less other freelancers competing with you. So these are all choices you have to make. If you want to get a job as an employed developer, you of course should think about where do I want to work, in which area, in which company, and which type of developer do they need. These are all little choices. But again, if you're starting off, getting a broad vision, an idea of what's available and how it works is key and super important. And once you made the decision on what you want to focus on, it becomes easier to understand how all these things relate and which framework you should learn as the next step, because you will know what your next goals and steps are. And then it's already less intimidating than if you look at the whole picture at the start. Speaking about that whole picture, thus far I talked about frontend, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and the backend, PHP and so on. Now, the image on the beginning showed way more logos, and it wasn't actually close to being complete. The next step you will probably make at some point of time, once you learned the basics and once you made your decision what to dive into next, is to dive into some libraries and frameworks for both frontend and backend, depending on what you want to focus on. Or if you are a full stack developer, obviously both. So what are libraries and frameworks then? Here are some examples, and as always, there are tons and tons and tons of additional libraries and frameworks. Now, in general, a library is a package, a third-party package, so it's unpackaged code, which is distributed, which was created by someone, which gives you some utility functions, which focuses on solving a single problem or just a small subset of problems. For example, jQuery is a library. It gives you utility functions for working with the DOM, for sending AJAX requests, for all these things. React is a library. React gives you utility functions for also working with the DOM, but in a different way than jQuery does this. React actually is a special case because it quickly enters the framework world, to which I'll come back in a second, once you add more packages to it. Now, other libraries would be RxJS, which adds utility functions when it comes to observables. And these are all JavaScript libraries I talked about. Of course, there are libraries for every programming languages. Some deal with handling dates better, some deal with converting text or creating safe passwords. Libraries have one goal. They take common tasks, encapsulate them, and give you a function, to make it really simple, you can call, which then spits out the desired result, so that you don't have to worry about writing that code on your own. Of course, the trade-off is that you have less possibilities of customizing that solution, that you have the danger of running insecure code if you don't closely analyze the plugin or the library, and of course that you might also have some overhead. If you have a utility library that adds some useful functions and you only need one of these functions, then you might still import the code for the other functions too. Hence you increase your code base, which means you have to ship more code to your end user, which can be a disadvantage. Still, libraries are very popular because they make a lot of things easier. And it's always about making that trade-off and thinking about it. Now, what are frameworks then? Frameworks and libraries, you can really have a philosophical discussion about this. A framework is basically more than a library. It offers more utility, and besides that, it offers a clear set of rules on how you have to build your app or a certain part of your app. For example, Angular and Vue are JavaScript frameworks. They give you the full tool set of a router to parse URLs and load different pages. They give you state management features so that you can easier manage the application state. And they give you clear rules on how you have to use these packages. Frameworks therefore typically make it easier for you as a developer to build applications. Because you get a lot of utility things, you get clear rules, you have less things you can mess up, to put it in simple words. Now, frameworks may also introduce new things you can mess up though, and frameworks obviously bear the danger of adding a lot of overhead. If you had the danger of importing some functions you don't need when pulling in a library, well, that danger multiplies if you have a whole framework. Still, frameworks like Angular, Vue, or React, together with Redux and Router, are very popular these days because they do one important thing. They allow you as a developer to easily build amazing, fast web applications and focus on the core business logic. And these are all just front-end frameworks. We also have server-side frameworks, of course, like Laravel, which is a PHP framework. Laravel takes vanilla PHP and builds up on it, giving you a clear way of how you build PHP, MVC applications, how you structure them, giving you a lot of utility, and therefore making it easier for you to build PHP applications. Express.js would be the same for Node.js. Gives you a lot of utility and some clear rules on how you may use it, how you may build your Node.js application to make that easier. So making things easier for the developer always is the goal of frameworks and libraries. They come at a trade-off, but they often also allow you to build things you wouldn't have been able to build before, or which you might have built in a very inefficient way, or which you might have built in an insecure way. Because as most frameworks are also open source, they constantly evolve, they become better, they are written in clean and efficient code. These are all good reasons why you want to pick a framework and library. And these are the reasons why you want to dive into libraries and frameworks once you mastered and understood the basics. One common mistake I see people make though is that they start off their learning experience with a library or a framework. And I don't think that's a super good idea, because you never fully understand the basics you're building up on. You quickly are lost if your framework or a library doesn't solve a certain problem for you because you don't know how to solve it on your own. This is something you should avoid. You should always understand the basics you're building up on. You should understand how JavaScript works and how you write vanilla JavaScript code. And sometimes you might then also be able to make the decision that you don't need a library or don't need a framework for a given problem because the basics are enough. So these are all things you should keep in mind. Still, diving into frameworks and libraries is a good next step, but don't do it as your first step. And therefore, don't be overwhelmed by the fact that you got a lot of libraries and frameworks. Learn the basics first, and then think about problems you want to solve, and you will then find the right framework or library by digging through their documentation, reading through Stack Overflow, reading through blog posts, and finding out which library or framework solves a certain problem for you. Now that was a lot of talking about libraries and frameworks. We also have to think about the users we're targeting, the platforms we're targeting. Frameworks and libraries allow us to solve problems and build, in the best case, better applications. However, the kind of applications we build also depends on the target platform we're building it for. And there, we of course have different browsers we can target. And we also have mobile versus desktop, which is a huge change we experienced over the last years. On desktop, we have vast amounts of power at our disposal. We got a typically good internet connection, and we got an abundance of space on the screen. On mobile, it's the total opposite. The CPU power is becoming better, but still worse than on most desktop machines. The space we have available is much smaller, and even worse than that, highly unpredictable. We don't know if the user is going to use our page on landscape mode or portrait, on a tablet, on a phablet, on a big smartphone, a small smartphone. We don't know these things. And we also might have very bad internet connections. So mobile versus desktop, that changed a lot. And then we got different browsers, and we can't force our users to use the browser we want them to use. Especially in companies, traditional older companies, a lot of people are stuck to older versions of Internet Explorer. Now for some web apps, you might be able to ignore these because they're not your target user base. For other web apps, they might be the core user base. So that is what I mean with think about the target platform you're building for. If you are essentially building an app for big companies, and I don't mean tech companies, but older companies like BMW, stuff like that, then chances are you need to support older browsers and your main focus might be on desktop. On the other hand, if you're building the next Tinder clone, the next Instagram clone, well then it's typically a mobile focused user base. It's typically using Safari or Chrome because these are the default browsers on mobile devices. And you got a different set of rules you have to keep in mind when building your application. So it's always important to understand what am I building for so that you're able to understand which features may I use. Because the features I can add to my web app of course depend on the target browser, but also on the target device. If you ship a lot of code down the wire because you have a super big framework and thousands of libraries, it's not that good on a mobile device. You want to keep your code base small there. These are all things which make it extremely challenging to develop great web applications. And I'll be super honest here, the journey there never stops. There's always something new to learn when it comes to optimizing your code, writing leaner code, writing code which works on more browsers, and so on. And that doesn't become easier at the current rate of innovation we have in web browsers. We get more and more cool features we can use every day, but we always have to keep in mind, hey, these features don't run everywhere. We always have to make that decision, which feature do we want to implement? Do we have a fitting fallback? And how can we implement it without having our file size explode? That is probably one of the most challenging parts in web development. Focusing on your audience and making the decision which technology to use, how to optimize it, and so on. And as I mentioned, this is a part where the learning never stops and where you constantly have to stay motivated to stay up to date and to keep on learning. Now, when we talk about targeting different browsers and audiences and devices, a very important part is that we actually build our code in a way that automatically optimizes it for us, so that we as a developer have a convenient way of building our app and still ship code that runs on as many devices as possible. And for that, I got this last section of technologies I want to talk about: build tools and productivity tools. Now, these are, for example, Webpack, Babel, SaaS. There's way more than that, obviously, as always. And the goal of these tools is that we never ship them to the user. They only run on our local machine whilst we are building the app. These tools transform, for example, CSS, so that we can use a nicer CSS syntax and still ship normal CSS at the end. These tools can bundle our many JavaScript files into just a view. They can make sure we can load them lazily, which means when we need them. They can optimize our JavaScript and CSS code. They can allow us to write JavaScript with next generation JavaScript features. All these things are handled by such build and productivity tools. And it can also become overwhelming to understand which tool to use when. This is probably the reason why we see a lot of CLIs, command line interfaces, coming up these days. We got one for Angular, for Vue, for React essentially. So for all these major frameworks, we got tools that generate a project for us. A project which already uses a lot of these productivity tools. So the good thing is you oftentimes don't even have to learn these tools. You can get a working project out of the box. And if it isn't your job in your company to really build up your own workflow or squeeze out the last bit of performance, you might never need to dive deeply into these tools. It might still be worth to pick up some basic knowledge on them so that you understand what's happening, but that definitely shouldn't be your number one thing to learn. Again, learn the basics first, then maybe dive into a library or framework. Think about your audience to understand how to choose the right library or framework and the right feature you want to use. And then also use productivity tools, if possible, in pre-built projects, possibly generated by a CLI, to work on your projects. And then optionally dive deeper into these productivity tools to understand what they do and to tweak them to your needs. And with that, you might still feel like, this is so much. And it is. There are a lot of things you can learn when being a web developer. But make it easier for you. Start with the things I outlined in the order I outlined, and then optionally dive into some of the advanced features. Stay up to date. Keep yourself up to date about what's happening in the web space, but don't feel too pressured to always adopt a new feature as one of the first people, because chances are you would be the only one, and this can be an advantage sometimes, but also it doesn't have to be, and it can just lead to unlimited pressure. Instead, stay up to date, but also stay focused. Learn the basics, keep on learning, and eventually you will reach that point where it's easier to learn new things, to see how they fit in the bigger picture, and to build web applications that use all these different tools, libraries, and frameworks, and you know why you use them. So I hope this video, which was mainly me talking about it, was a bit helpful. It was something new I wanted to try out because I get this question a lot. What should I learn next? What is X, Y, Z? So I hope I could help with that video. Definitely share your opinion in the comments. Can't wait to read them. Bye.